Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm Don Arleth, and coming to you live from Warsaw. You're watching World News Tonight here on TVP World. Our attitude towards transatlantic relations and NATO must remain unquestionable, said Prime Minister Donald Tusk in Parliament. In his speech, he referred to the international situation and Poland's security after the European summit in Brussels. The head of government also spoke about military training for all Poles to be ready for war. We'll have more on that in just a bit, but first, the latest headlines. Will Europe unite on security and defense? Trump says Ukraine is harder to deal with than Russia. And a tribunal is set to hear cases of Russian aggression. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has made headlines today by announcing a plan to train all adults for military service. He added that Poland is ready to withdraw from the Dublin and Ottawa Conventions, which previously banned landmines and cluster munitions. To top it all off, Poland wants access to nuclear weapons, something France has floated as a viable option for Europe. Marek Steele reports.
We've made tremendous progress
in a world upended by Donald Trump's reversal of U.S. policies, the Polish government is considering pulling out of treaties on mines and cluster munitions. All military-aged men may soon be called up for training.
We will try to have a model ready by the end of the year so that every adult male in Poland is trained for war and our reserves are adequate for the possible threats.
Donald Tusk's proposals come just a day after European leaders backed plans to spend more on defense.
There's a huge pressure on all member states to increase their defense spending and to have literally a surge in defense. And therefore the rearm plan with the 5 elements was very much welcomed by all leaders.
Plans that could provide as much as 800 billion euros to beef up the bloc's defense consist of unleashing the use of public funds for defense at the national level.
What's important is that the strong signal has been already sent that we need, as Europe, spend more on defense, and we need new tools.
A new loan instrument will provide 150 billion euros in loans to member states, and more EU funds are to be directed towards defense-related investments.
Defense is something that the European Union did not do as part of the core business that it was also set up to do. So this is basically groundbreaking.
The money could go to many different areas within defense, but it seems that arms production will be central. The defense sector says it is ready for the challenge.
The European defence industry is fully able and ready to rapidly increase production further, deliver at pace and meet European needs as soon as orders are placed.
Poland hopes to secure billions of EU funds for its border reinforcement project called East Shield, which is aimed at slowing down a possible Russian invasion.
Europe is faced with the new reality of being self-reliant for its own security, including in Ukraine, as the transatlantic relationship appears to hang in the balance. It could be a wake-up call for the continent, with EU leaders forced to come together to find unity, but not everyone is on board. Our chief political correspondent, Aaron Dahmen, reports.
This French senator is sounding the alarm.
Washington has become the court of Nero, an incendiary emperor, submissive courtiers, and a buffoon high on ketamine in charge of purging the civil service. This is a tragedy for the free world, but it is first and foremost a tragedy for the United States.
His stark message going viral online as America squeezes Europe to ramp up Ukraine defense efforts. In Brussels, the tone was more pomp and proper after EU leaders met late into the night on Thursday to voice their backing for the war-torn country.
We all want a peace through strength, a just and lasting peace, but a peace from a position of strength. And this is also in the interest of President Trump.
But one voice was missing in that statement of support, Hungary pulling the pin on a show of unity.
Good evening, how are you? Long day, isn't it? So, sorry? No, it's not about blame.
An EU diplomatic source told TVP World Orban threw in the towel around 15 minutes into talks behind closed doors, with just 3 of the proposed 16 conclusions agreed upon. They state that the 27 member states exchanged views with Volodymyr Zelensky, discussed the latest developments in Ukraine, and moved the issue to the agenda of their next meeting later this month. That triggered 26 countries to release their own conclusions, with European Council President Antonio Costa insisting that everyone ultimately wants peace.
The difference is that 26 believe that the path to peace is by strengthening Ukraine's defense capacity. Hungary has isolated itself from this consensus. It stands alone. A country alone does not create division.
On Friday morning, Costa and his European Commission counterpart Ursula von der Leyen even hosted a video call to update leaders from the likes of Turkey, Canada and the UK.
Great pleasure to see you.
Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union deals with serious breaches of its founding values and can include sanctions or the suspension of voting rights. Proceedings are currently frozen against Hungary, as all member states other than the one accused must agree to the move. But could Thursday's split reignite the debate?
My assumption is that something else is happening. We've already seen this during the Hungarian Council presidency, and even before that whenever there is unanimity required among the member states, and Hungary goes against it, then there will be a coalition of the willing of other countries, maybe not even 26, but 20 or 24 or 5, that will adopt certain policies.
It comes as European powers vouch for their own security capabilities. France has opened the door to using its nuclear deterrent to protect the continent, a shift welcomed by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Germany, which has long prioritised transatlantic bonds, is changing its tune under Chancellor-in-waiting Friedrich Merz, who wants to amend the country's constitution to boost defence spending. And what all EU member states did agree on this week in Brussels was hundreds of billions of euros in defence cash.
It's up to the European leaders, to fulfil those pledges about rearmament, increasing defence spending, and then we might see how, Putin reacts to that. At the moment, I'm pretty sure he's discounting that as it being anything serious at all.
With Ukrainian and American officials now set for talks in Saudi Arabia next week, another chapter is being written in this fight for peace. Aaron Darman, TVP World.
It's been a wild ride lately, processing the statements and signals made by Donald Trump and his administration, of course, over the past several days. Today, the U.S. president indicated that he would place more crippling sanctions on Russia. However, this comes as weapons deliveries and intelligence sharing to Ukraine have been frozen indefinitely. Now let's go to our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Chatterjee. Good evening, Oz. Now, have we seen a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel? We've seen this slight change in the rhetoric of Donald Trump.
Good evening, Don. Well, wild ride indeed, as it is for all reporters trying to get a grip on what the White House's policy towards Ukraine and Russia is from these statements that are fired off by President Trump on social media. Earlier on, firing one off, saying that he was strongly considering sanctions and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire or a final settlement on peace is reached. Now, it's unclear what he meant by these kind of crippling sanctions, given that Russia is already under very, very, very severe sanctions from the United States. There was no detail in the words. And now that messaging might sound more positive towards Kyiv, who've been at the receiving end of threats and, the cutting off, suspension of aid and so on. But then later on in the day, Donald Trump had a press conference again. And here's what he had to say during that press conference.
I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine. And they don't have the cards. They don't have the cards. As you know, we're meeting in Saudi Arabia on sometime next week, early. And we're talking, I find that in terms of getting a final settlement, it may be easier dealing with Russia, which is surprising because they have all the cards.
So this came after Reuters had reported that the Trump administration was considering easing some sanctions on Russia to get them round the negotiating table. So very confusing set of mixed messages coming from the US administration as to what they currently intend. Now, Russia, as these talks are ongoing, Russia has continued to strike Ukraine with 67 missiles and 194 drones targeting Ukrainian territory. And now this comes as the US has cut off intelligence sharing with Ukraine on early warning signs for these kinds of missiles. So Ukraine is fighting with one arm behind its back while these statements are being released by Donald Trump. Now, as for the Ukrainian view on peace, here's what President Zelensky had to say in his statement released earlier on today.
Today, this Russian strike on our energy system, on our civilian facilities, took place as usual for Russia, as mean and cynical as always, as if there were no efforts at all by Ukraine and the world to end this war. Ukraine is ready for peace as soon as possible. We have proposed specific steps. And every day, new Russian attacks and reality itself prove that it is Russia that must be forced to make peace, to stop the war, to engage in real diplomacy, to guarantee security, and to achieve a reliable, lasting peace.
So Kyiv, they're trying its hardest to build ties with the Trump administration to come up with some kind of unified strategy to dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All eyes now towards Saudi Arabia on Monday when Zelensky is due to arrive for discussions with the Crown Prince. And he's staying until Tuesday when the US delegation arrives. And these will be the first high-level discussions between the US and Ukraine since those scenes in the Oval Office. So all to play for still next week. Back to you in the studio, Don.
All right, Oz. Well, hopefully Ukraine will be easier to deal with than next week. Thank you very much for that report. Now we go to Brussels, where a tribunal tasked with adjudicating Russian crimes of aggression against Ukraine is expected to be improved in the coming weeks. Many in the Belgian capital see this as a small win for the war-torn country, which has been pummeled by Russia's full-scale invasion over 3 years. Our EU correspondent Angela Skujins has more from Brussels.
The Special Tribunal for Crimes of Aggression against Ukraine is one step closer to becoming a reality. The EU Commissioner for Justice, Michael McGrath, told reporters in the Belgian capital on Thursday that it was expected European leaders would approve the measure in the coming weeks. Now, once it becomes realised, the tribunal aims to hold Russian President Vladimir Putin to account for the leadership position and the role that he played in Russia's 4-year invasion of Ukraine. Poland's Justice Minister, Adam Bodnar, announced that he was pleased that this measure was gaining pace. He attended those high-level justice talks in the Belgian capital. Here is what he had to say regarding that announcement.
We have reaffirmed our commitment to fight Russian impunity in the context of accountability for war crimes committed as a result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And we have discussed different practical steps that can be taken by the EU and the EU member states in this context, including support for the establishment of the Special Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression.
The European Commissioner for Justice, Michael McGrath, said that the tribunal will have a two-pronged effect. Not only will it hold that Russian leader to account, but it will also support Ukraine and that country's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, as he navigates increasingly knotty ceasefire negotiations with the Kremlin. Here is what that EU official had to say on Friday.
There is a recognition that this is a vital instrument that will result in justice being served in relation to those who are guilty of the crime of aggression against the people of Ukraine, and getting this work complete in the coming weeks will strengthen the hand of Ukraine in the context of the peace negotiations that we all hope will begin to take place over the days and weeks ahead.
Now, while the guts of the tribunal we're talking about, the legal framework, is yet to be revealed, we're expecting that to be laid bare in the coming weeks, as well as a claims commission. Now, this will be a body that will be determining how much money Russia will need to pay for its crimes of aggression. That is expected to be set up at the end of March. Angela Skujins from Brussels for TVP World.
A coup d'etat in Romania. Authorities have arrested 2 of the 6-member Romanian Vlad the Impaler group, which have been accused of trying to overthrow the government. It is not yet known whether the men had contacts with the controversial presidential candidate Calin Georgescu, but according to investigators, the group had ties to 2 Russian diplomats who have been declared persona non grata. Natalia Komarov reports.
2 Romanian nationals charged with treason were put under 30-day detention by authorities in Bucharest, a day after being detained for questioning together with 4 more individuals, all members of a paramilitary organization calling itself the Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, Command.
They are reservists that belong to the MOD, to the Ministry of Defense, and this is where we have a huge vulnerability. A lot of these folks that used to be during the communists in the Securitate, in the intelligence services. Right now they are nostalgic of the Soviet Union, of Russia.
The Vlad Tepes group called for Romania's withdrawal from NATO, a geopolitical realignment with Russia, China and Iran, and for replacing the Romanian state with a new leadership structure which would be led by a Council of the Wise.
They were making TikTok videos, talking about taking Romania out of NATO, but nobody really paid attention to them. Up until, from today until tomorrow, we saw a guy with 2% getting 33% and getting the first in the first presidential round.
Romanian intelligence services said in a statement that the detained individuals were receiving help from the Russian embassy.
They had multiple contacts with the Russian military attaché at the embassy and his deputy, which, by the way, they were declared persona non grata yesterday, right after the arrest. So obviously there was a coordination between the Russians and these guys.
The arrests come at a time when Romania is stepping up efforts to protect its democracy from foreign influence, particularly election interference.
Police has been doing a good job since the presidential tour was cancelled, and although it's been only 2-3 months, I mean, a lot has been happening.
For now, it's unclear whether the paramilitary group had any connection with the Russia-backed presidential candidate Calin Georgescu.
And now it's time to head to Greenland and check in with the locals. Donald Trump has repeatedly expressed his desire for the United States to acquire the self-governed frozen island nation, which is an independent territory of Denmark. Just recently, Trump said the United States would take Greenland one way or the other. Sonia Garabishchan is on the ground there and brings us the story.
In a Congress speech, President Donald Trump said that the United States would acquire Greenland one way or another. It is against this backdrop that the parliamentary elections are taking place next week. TVP World came to Greenland to get an idea of what are some of the hopes ahead of these elections.
My hope is that we'll have a clear answer on the future for Greenland. And I think in many ways, of course, the interest from Trump is something that is very much on everybody's mind. But of course, also the interest from Denmark. That is very important for us to make sure that we stand much more on our own ground, that we represent ourselves. And that is why we're saying nothing about us without us, nothing about Greenland without Greenland.
As a self-governing territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, independence is a key issue, having an impact on the atmosphere ahead of these elections.
So I think the last part of the election is to be able to try to find some kind of common ground in the debates. They don't want to have a sovereign state. So they are very close, but if you don't want to be a sovereign state, if you don't want to own Greenland, it's difficult to have a discussion or find common ground.
The elections are scheduled for 11th of March, and they will determine 31 members of the Greenlandic Parliament. From Nuuk for TVP World, Sonia Gatavistian.
After the extraordinary meeting of leaders in Brussels, support for Ukraine and the initiative for European defense seems to be laying squarely on the shoulders of Europe. Recently, the actions of U.S. administration officials have left more questions than answers when it comes to transatlantic relations and American reliability. Now, joining me to discuss our current position and where we are headed is Cordelia Buchanan-Poncek, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. It's great to see you, and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, now we were just discussing a minute ago that we do live in interesting times for the moment. But when we look at U.S. military aid to Ukraine, something that seems to be having an immediate impact at the moment is the freezing of the weapons deliveries and the intelligence sharing to Ukraine. What do you think are the main contributing factors? Is this the blow-up in the White House? And when can we maybe expect these measures to be withdrawn and the resumption of military intelligence and weapons deliveries?
It's a great question. And first of all, I like the tie a lot. Very strong statement. Second of all, yes, we were talking about what crazy times we live in, and I've likened it to drinking out of a fire hose. There's a lot of water gushing out, but you feel like you're not catching very much, and the thirst is there. Last time I was in the studio, I opened by saying two things. First, that this war is still ongoing in Ukraine, and second, at the time, that military aid was still flowing. Well, one of those statements is still true, but the other one isn't true anymore. The war is still ongoing, as we have seen from Russia's incessant barrage of Ukraine over the past 24 hours, but the military aid has stopped. And not only that, but intelligence sharing has stopped. And this is really shocking. It feels like the White House is turning all the screws on the Ukrainians to bring them to the table. But as Zelensky has said time and time and time again, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. So it's beginning to feel almost cruel, horrifying to see some of these measures coming out and beginning to wonder, well, what does Ukraine need to do in order to turn the faucet back on, the faucet of military aid, the faucet of intelligence sharing? I will add, just for fairness, that today probably you have seen that Donald Trump finally did take issue with the Russians. He finally spoke out. He threatened further sanctions. He said that Russia needs to come to the table. And I think a part of that has been the statements that that Zelensky has made over the past week to say, we are ready for peace. We are ready to come to the table. We are ready to do what it takes, really moving that back to the court, the ball back to the court for the Russians to respond and return to the table as well.
Do you think that the United States has kind of folded an otherwise good hand that it was given? And I say this in that it seems like they had a bit of leverage, and that leverage seems to have disappeared at this point. Do you think that the U.S. strategy is to woo Vladimir Putin to the table in expressing all these Russian talking points and not wanting to discuss who started the war, who invaded who?
We have heard from the administration it didn't work before. You've had 3 years to do this. We have tried, making these statements, blaming Russia. It didn't work. So let's try something new. Certainly the administration has said that time and time and time again. But that's why I bring up this turning of the screws, because I think that it would be possible to perhaps take a lesser stance against Russia, but to simultaneously be so unkind to the Ukrainians has really put Zelensky in a difficult position and really made the maneuvering around the peace deal into a very large fiasco that it did not have to be.
Certainly seems that way. Now, the minerals deal is still hanging in the balance. Do you think it's in Ukraine's interest to go ahead and sign that deal, ink that deal as soon as possible? Do you think that'll please Donald Trump? And do you think that this will give the United States some skin in the game so that somewhere down the road there is this link, this bond between the United States and Ukraine that they so eagerly need?
Certainly, and I'll take a step back and a personal anecdote. I was preparing something on this minerals deal to release last Friday. So I sent it off to my editor for comments. Then I stepped out, and suddenly I'm getting all of these notifications on my phone because I thought, well, it's a done deal. Zelensky's visit to the White House is just a rubber stamp on this this deal that's already been agreed to. And then all these notifications are coming through. I think, what could possibly be going on? Well, now we know what was going on. Quite something, and obviously really shocking scenes over a deal that I do think that Ukraine is prepared to sign. I also want to say, so people have been using the deal word very, I guess, very much not with context. It's a memorandum of understanding, which means that it's not legally binding. It's a statement of intent. And what the statement of intent is essentially to establish a fund. And this would be an investment fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And so the deal, the Memorandum of Understanding, stipulates that as Ukraine has these assets, these natural resources that can be monetized, that 50% of the profits from the monetization of those assets, they'll be put into this fund. And then that fund is going to be used to invest reconstruction and development of Ukraine. Another really important part of this deal that I want to highlight is this is not just minerals. Surely Ukraine has critical raw materials, and we can talk about that, but it also includes oil and gas, traditional hydrocarbons, and it includes infrastructure. This is port infrastructure and LNG terminals, for example. And aside that, it doesn't include the current state-owned assets of Ukraine, so something like Naftogaz. So the way that I see this, it has really been portrayed as an exploitation of Ukraine. But Ukraine itself stated that actually it will retain full ownership of the minerals. And so I don't necessarily see it in the same exploitive way as others. It's almost like a two-country sovereign wealth fund, and we do have examples of that. The European Investment Fund would be one such example. For a singular country, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund would be an example. Places where a fund is used because of natural resources and then can take those, the money that's put into the pot and put it towards investment. It does seem to have been watered down from the initial versions that we saw that were leaked into something that's much more acceptable for Ukraine.
Right, and Donald Trump presumably won't be the president forever, so the conditions, or if something is deemed maybe a little bit unfair, it can be corrected in the future, could it not?
Presumably it could be corrected, although I must say that there are still a couple points that for me are lacking clarity, and one of those is actually the ratification of the deal. So once the Memorandum of Understanding is signed, presumably the Americans take it to Congress, and then the Ukrainians take it to Parliament and put it through a ratification process, and then we could see how that might play out in U.S. Congress right now, for example, and different aspects that might be raised there that would be relevant to the Trump presidency, but then also to future Republican or Democratic candidates.
Let's move on because we're almost out of time. The EU summit in Brussels, what do you think is the biggest development that you see with European leaders coming together there?
Common debt. Common debt is an incredible step forward. We saw it with COVID-19. My big talking point on the common debt is the ability, potentially, for the euro to overtake the dollar as a reserve currency. The dollar has been doing wild things because of the tariff back and forth that's been going on. Currently, the euro is about 20% of global reserve currency, and part of that's been held back because there is no common debt in the European Union. Such steps on common debt are huge takeaways for investors that would be very interested in getting a piece of that pie. Aside of that, talks on the nuclear deal, the nuclear umbrella, and then talks on how to cooperate with the United Kingdom, for example. These are huge takeaways from these summits.
Right, and 800 billion euros, that seems like a lot of money. Would your expectations be, because Europe seems like it needs to play catch up quite a bit really quick, do you think that this money will come together and be expedited in the way it's spent and spent well?
It's hard to say. I mean, the European Union has talked big before and then had problems when it came to scaling up. There's a question of how the money is going to be spent at national levels in order to help defense champions at the nation-state level. The money could also be spent in order to use abroad, either with the United States, South Korea, Israel. So these arms deals are something that could be put on the table. But how we see this at the nation level, we'll see how it plays out. It's an open question for me.
All right. Okay. All right, well, Cordelia Buchanan-Poncek, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight, but do stay tuned because Face to Face with Adam Yasser and Michał Broniatowski is coming up next. See you later.